All right, I think we can start. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar. Thank you for attending this webinar, which is part of the Human Development series of IIIT. It's all under this umbrella of advancing education in Muslim societies. We have had several this year and last year where we touched upon topics that are of importance for us, not only in theory, but also in practice and in research. Because AIMS focuses on research and empirical and theoretical research, and IIIT has been conducting research in different ways for a long time, I think it makes sense for us to also share with you some of the ideas that we have been exposed to in the field in terms of the human development and the specifics of human development in Muslim societies. We have touched upon topics like cosmopolitanism. We talked about the spiral dynamics model. We talked about some emerging fields and research in human development. And today we are honored to host Professor Everett Worthington, who is a professor emeritus working from the Department of Psychology at Virginia Commonwealth University. He is affiliated with the Institute of Quantitative Social Science. He's a faculty of arts and science at Harvard University. He also continues to be active in research and speaking around the globe. And he has published over 40 books and around 500 articles, maybe even more by now. And he has contributed scholarly chapters, as well as models that he contributed to the field of mostly forgiveness, humility, and positive psychology. He has worked in therapy with marriage and family topics, and religion and spirituality. He is famous for his REACH forgiveness model, which we may hear about today. If you'd like more information about AIMS as an initiative, our empirical research agenda, where we actually examined forgiveness and forgiveness attitudes, or if you want more information on this whole human development program, please go to our website. Our Salwa has been pasting it in the chat. Now, if you are interested in more information about Professor Worthington's work, he actually has his own website, and you can go and explore some of his publications, some of his ideas, and some of his contribution to the field of forgiveness, spirituality, and religion. Professor Worthington will speak about forgiveness as one way of many ways of handling injustice. So the floor is for you, Professor, and we will hear him for 40 minutes. And after that, we will do the questions and answers. Please feel free to write some of your questions in the chat or actually in the Q&A. It's probably easier if you do that in the Q&A. We would like also, before we start, to ask everyone to remain muted and to also remain, keep your videos off. With all of this, I hope you enjoyed the talk and learned something today. I'm sure I will. I have used the work of Professor Worthington for many years in my own research and publications, and I'm thrilled to have you with us here today, and the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm very happy to be with you all today, and hope to be able to share some things that will be of use to you. So I have a kind of a focused agenda. I think that there are three things that we need for a harmonious future. One of those is humility, one is forgiveness, and the other reconciliation. And so I structure the talk that way, in which I look at an evidence-based practice of in psychology for building humility. And then I spend the rest of the time talking about forgiveness. And, we'll, of course, deal with my REACH forgiveness model to just a couple of slides on it. And I'll talk just a bit about reconciliation, but I really don't have a whole section on reconciliation. It just shows up within my talk on forgiveness. So this is my mission for today. So yeah, what's wrong with the world today? I have 40 minutes and this is going to take about 2 slides. So I guess one of the biggest challenges that we have in the world today in virtually every country is the polarization that seems to be in existence and also seems to be widening. So this polarization is really in lots of different areas, from politics to religion to worldview. And so I think that one of the things that's contributed to this, I go back to John Gottman, a psychologist, a research psychologist, and a clinical psychologist, who looks at how relationships disintegrate when they do disintegrate. And he says that there is this downward cascade that in which at the beginning a relationship starts to be characterized by some criticism of each of the parties. And of course, as soon as that criticism happens, then defensiveness pops up. So the criticism spreads from, first of all, I criticize, let's say, my partner silently to myself, and then secondly, aloud to my partner, and then third to third parties, I start to criticize my partner. As that happens, the partner responds with defensiveness, first to herself, second to back in our conversation, and third to third parties. But the key in the deterioration of relationship is not really about criticism and defensiveness. That basically happens in every relationship, and we deal with that, we accept that, and usually move on. But when things change for the worse, the way that they change is one partner stops being focused on the issues and starts being focused on the person or the personality of the other person, and in fact looks with contempt at that other person. Once that happens, the satisfaction in the relationship falls off of the table, and that usually leads to either one of 2 outcomes, which John Gottman calls war or stonewalling. Stonewalling is emotionally disengaging from the relationship and saying, basically, you can't get to me, I don't need you, and I'm not going to pay attention to anything you say. So if criticism, if contempt is kind of the thing that polarizes people around the world, then we start to look at, well, how could we make a more harmonious society? And I think one of the ways is somehow deal with that attitude that leads to contempt. And and the second is then, how do we repair damage that gets done by this contemptuous treatment of the other party? And that's going to end up being forgiving and reconciling. So that is my 3-pronged strategy for world harmony in a mere, 3 minutes. So, if only so many other problems were as easy to deal with. Of course, my tongue is firmly in my cheek on this. So how do we deal with contempt? My answer is through humility. Contempt is really judging the other person. It sets me up as better than the other person, able to judge that person. So if I can deal with this person in humility instead of contempt, that is going to probably short circuit the contempt. So what is humility? Well, we believe through the research that we've done that there are 4 necessary and sufficient conditions for humility. One is to own your own strengths and weaknesses. That is to have an accurate awareness and then an implementation of your own strengths and dealing with your own weaknesses. Second, to have an attitude of teachability regarding those weaknesses and wanting to find out what am I weak in so that I can correct that. A third necessary and sufficient condition for humility is the interpersonal end of things, and that is to have a modest self-presentation instead of an arrogant self-presentation, or one that just blows off the other person. And then the fourth aspect of humility, which I believe is necessary, is an orientation toward others that lifts them up instead of putting them down. Again, we're seeing that, you know, this arrogance and this judgment of others is what contempt is all about. But humility is something that lifts others up instead of putting them down. So we have created a workbook to promote humility. It's a 7-hour workbook. We've tested it in a number of studies that are put forth in 2 publications to date. We're in the middle of a trial adapting that workbook to political humility, which we don't really think of as an oxymoron, although some people do say that those are contradictory to each other. So what we did in these studies of this 7-hour do-it-yourself workbook on humility is we measured traits because we wanted to see if completing a workbook on humility would change dispositions and traits and not just states where I feel more humble or I feel more patient. And so we are looking at whether the workbook works and also does it replicate. So our first study, here are the results of that study. And what we did was we compared people who completed the workbook with people who did not. And we measured them before and after the workbook. And the after was 2 weeks after completing the workbook. So we were trying to see, does this last? And we measured traits. And so what we can see is that, what a surprise, people who completed a humility workbook became more humble by trait. Wow, this is science, folks. But the really amazing thing, I think, is that humility drug along other virtues. And people who completed the humility workbook became more trait forgiving, even though they did not, even though forgiveness was not mentioned in the humility workbook. They became less overall negative in their affect and their stable mood, and they became more patient. Whereas people who, were in the control condition did not change over time. Well, those people were actually in a study in which people were randomly assigned to a virtue, a workbook complete about a virtue. And humility was just one of those virtues. There was also a case of self-forgiveness, one of patience, not self-forgiveness, self-control, patience, and forgiveness. So people didn't have a choice as to which virtue they were assigned to. So we thought, well, what if we recruited people who were interested in becoming more humble? Would this make any difference? Would they do better than somebody who just got assigned to complete a humility workbook? So we replicated this with people who were recruited actually because they wanted to become more humble. And indeed, you can see that people got even better. They got even more humble than the people who were randomly assigned to a humility workbook, more forgiving, more patient, and less negative in their mood. So just showing you the effect sizes of that, we can see with study 1 in the first number in parentheses, and study 2, the second number. These are the number of standard deviations, or the amount of a percent of a standard deviation that, that is changed. So in the first study, trait humility, they changed by 0.35 standard deviations. In the second study, 0.86. Forgivingness, again, almost doubled. Trait patience, no statistical difference. Self-control, no difference. Trait positivity, no difference. And trait negativity, 10 times the change in trait negativity. So we know that these workbooks to promote humility are evidence-based. There have been other studies of these workbooks as well, but we know that these workbooks can help people change in their traits and their dispositions. So if you're interested in getting these, I give you my web address up here at the top, evworthington-forgiveness.com. And if you look over to that green area where it says reach forgiveness of others, 6 steps to forgiving yourself, and you see forgiveness manuals, if you click on that, then you will see all those DIY workbooks noted down, and there are forgiveness workbooks, and there are humility workbooks, and self-forgiveness workbooks, and patience workbooks. So, well, the other way that I mentioned was to try to repair the damage that might be done by these contemptuous attitudes toward others. And so that is to deal with unforgiveness by forgiving, and by dealing with unforgiveness in other ways. You know, I originally titled the talk something like dealing with unforgiveness by forgiveness and other methods. So I'm going to talk about that. And I wanted to, since we're looking at a religious context here, I wanted to just kind of give you a quick overview of forgiveness from the point of view of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Now, I realize this is a really delicate situation. Here I am, a Christian, and I'm going to try to make a summary of what Jews think about forgiveness, or Muslims think about forgiveness, or Christians think about forgiveness. I know that, you know, I can practically get into fistfights with other Christians. So I know there are many, many views of what forgiveness is within each religion. But I'm drawing basically on a chapter that was written in 2000, in which Mark Rye, the first author of this chapter, got people who were experts in their religious field to write a summary of the way that they believe their field, their religion deals with forgiveness. And it looked at the 5 major religions, so in the 3 Abrahamic religions plus Buddhism and Hinduism. So I'm drawing mostly from that. So a quick view of how the Jewish theologians treat forgiveness. Basically, God forgives. You know, all the Abrahamic religion, you know, that's a central thing. God is a forgiving God. And so this is divine forgiveness, but person-to-person forgiveness is also dealt with in each religion. And the key theological point of Judaism is that the person who was harmed, the person who was victimized, has to be the one that grants forgiveness. Now, that isn't always necessary, and there are some special conditions in Judaism in which people can just spontaneously forgive. Maimonides codified the steps to forgiveness back in the 13th century. So this is Maimonides' view. The offender who has hurt someone has left the path of God. and they must return to the path of God. And the word that is used is teshuvah, which in English we translate usually as repentance. So the person who is offended must return to the path of God. Well, how do we know if they've returned to the path of God? Well, they have to do these things, says Maimonides. They have to admit that they've done wrong. They have to take responsibility for their offenses. They have to sincerely and believably apologize, showing that they are regretful, remorseful that they have done wrong. They have to offer to make restitution, to make up for what they've done. And then they have to demonstrate conclusively that they will not do such a thing again. That's a hard thing in a close community, and often, requires actually that the person go outside of the community and, be tempted to be unforgiving in the way that they were before, but this time rise above it and not act in a hurtful way. If they have met all of these conditions, says Maimonides, then they can ask the person, the victim, directly, can you forgive me? And then the victim doesn't have to say yes. They don't have to forgive. In fact, they can say no twice without any kind of penalty. However, if the offender persists in the positive behavior, then and asks a third time, will you forgive me or can you forgive me? Then if the person refuses that third time, says Maimonides, then they have left the path of God, and they have to go through their own teshuvah process, their own return to the path of God. Now, the implication of that is that if there's no victim to grant forgiveness, then that is an unforgivable sin. And the most obvious case when that is the case is murder. If you murder someone, then that's an unforgivable sin. It can never be forgiven because the victim is not around to grant that forgiveness. So this is why Jewish people hold on to the Holocaust as really this totally unforgivable event and want to never forget it. Now, Islam, now I'm sure that you all know Islamic perspective on forgiveness better than I, but God forgives, one of the 99 names of God, a forgiving God. But what about person-to-person forgiveness? Well, Mark Rye's chapter says that the key theological point there is that in Islam, justice is really a central concept. And people are really entitled to see justice enacted. Whereas forgiveness is something that is valued, it's highly valued, it's something that it pleases God greatly if people forgive. But it's something that you do that's extraordinary and therefore gets an extraordinary reward from God by being forgiving. So this is a difference in the emphasis you can see with Judaism, of course. Now, in Christianity, again, like I say, just like in all of these religions, I'm sure that there are many different variations within the religion. So basically, God forgives freely, and in fact, forgives before the beginning of the world. And what people do here and now is to appropriate that forgiveness by accepting God's forgiveness. Jesus is part of the Trinity, the triune God, the three-part unified God, and Jesus forgives unilaterally in Jesus's teachings to his followers. This is not intended to apply to people who are not Jesus's followers, but to his followers, He says, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And then he explains that. He says, if you don't forgive those who sin against you, your Father in heaven won't forgive you. So forgiveness becomes something in Christianity that is required. It's central. Whereas in Islam, justice is more central. In Christianity, forgiveness is one of the two central pillars of Christianity. But Peter says, how many times do we have to forgive? Do we have to forgive 7 times? And Jesus says, not 7, but 77, which theologians tell me mean every time, 100% of the time, that 10,000 times. If a person hurts you, you always have to forgive them. Well, the disciples respond to that by going, this is hard, and they realize this is something that's really hard to do. In fact, it's pretty much impossible to do. So my conclusion of what the teaching in Christianity is that Jesus instructs his followers to make a decision to treat the offender differently as a valued and valuable person, and not to seek revenge on the person. And that is what is required in Christian forgiveness. But emotional forgiveness is something sometimes we will never be able to get to. If somebody offends me 77 times, it is almost impossible to believe that I will ever have my emotions go to 0. Jesus wants us to be able to be emotionally free of any negative emotions, but it doesn't require that. So the main difference here between Islam and Christianity is just what is emphasized. Both Islam and Christianity value both justice and forgiveness, but the emphasis is different. So what I did next is to try to go to social science and psychology for the most part, but other fields get in the act too, and kind of create 10 facts for understanding forgiveness scientifically. So I'm just going to run you through these quickly. 1, there are 4 types of forgiveness. There's divine forgiveness and self-forgiveness. And both of those are experienced mostly about being a person who has done wrong. I am seeking forgiveness from God, and I am dealing with my self-condemnation. And then there are 2 other types of forgiveness that are more from the perspective of I have been hurt, and those are human-to-human forgiveness and social or societal forgiveness, in which a leader in society makes a statement on behalf of the society regarding forgiveness. So there are 4 types of forgiveness. Second, transgressions create an injustice gap. That is, if I get harmed by someone, I create this gap that says I've experienced this much injustice, or this much injustice, or this much injustice. Small injustice gaps are easy to deal with. Large ones are hard to deal with. Now, the key thing is that these injustice gaps can be closed in many ways. So, for example, they can be closed if I see justice done. Rarely will this totally close my sense of injustice by seeing justice done. As we can see in research that's been done with people who view executions for capital crimes. People often come away from those saying, well, I thought when I saw this person executed that I wouldn't feel any negativity anymore, but I still feel it. Well, of course they do, because it's not just a life for a life. There were all kinds of other harms that went on, and those haven't been taken care of by just seeing the other person lose their life. So I can see justice done. I can turn the matter over to God. One way to turn it over to God is to turn it over to God for divine retribution. Another way is just to relinquish it to God, but I can turn it over to God. I can just say, well, I'm just going to put up with this. I'm just going to tolerate the negativity. So tolerance, people are pretty upset, but they're just tolerating it. They're not responding negatively. But they can also forbear. So forbearance is better than tolerance, in that it's being able to not respond negatively for the good of a group, for the good of our relationship, for the good of our family, for the good of our church or community, for the good of our nation or whatever. And even beyond that, I could just accept this. And just like, okay, life goes on. I'm just moving on past this. And then there's forgiveness. So forgiveness is another way that injustice gap can be narrowed. And the brilliant thing is, if I've got this big injustice gap, if I see injustice done, that can narrow part of it. If I decide to forbear, that can narrow more. If I decide to accept, that can narrow more. Now I only have to forgive this much. That's a lot easier than forgiving this much. So you can mix and match any of those ways. A third fact about forgiveness is that forgiveness can be a dramatic turning point in people's life. They can experience it as an emotional life change, or they can hardly know that it happened, but because they're acting differently and treating the person differently over the course of a journey of a life, they will end at a very different point than they ended when they started. A fourth, there are two kinds of forgiveness. I've already alluded to these: to make a decision about how you're going to act toward the person, and to emotionally replace the negative, unforgiving emotions with positive, other-oriented emotions like empathy for the person who hurt me. So that's what I said in this. Decisions are about one's intent to treat the person differently, and emotional replacement is emotional forgiveness. There are a lot of benefits to the forgiver for forgiving. So it blesses the person you forgive, of course, but there are also relational benefits of, if you restore the relationship after forgiveness, then you get a lot of those relational benefits for going forth. There's spiritual benefits of feeling more at peace and less at odds with people or with God. There are mental health benefits and benefits to your psychological well-being. And so, in fact, if you forgive, you're less depressed usually, and less anxious and more hopeful. Those have been shown by empirical research. And then finally, there are physical health benefits to forgiving. If you continue to hold a grudge, you create a allostatic load, a load of your body continually trying to energize that stress response, and that will have a lot of negative impact on people. So there are many benefits to the forgiver to forgive. 6, if you want to make it easier to be forgiven, if you have been someone who's done something to hurt someone else, then we need to act responsibly. And that means admitting to responsibility, confessing what we've done, and seeking to make amends or to atone for what we've done. And these also can promote reconciliation, because as I act differently, the other person sees me trying to be responsible and trying to confess and take responsibility and to be accountable for what I've done and atone for what I've done and offer to make restitution perhaps. So all of these ways of responding responsibly reduce the size of that injustice gap because the person sees that I'm doing something hard. I'm suffering. It's hard to admit my wrongdoing to the person. It's hard to make up for what I've done. So I think that we can forgive anything in principle, that there are no unforgivable sins. There are no unforgivable harms that we've done. So, you know, of course, that would put me at odds with a Jewish theological interpretation. So there's going to be differences here, but, you know, I believe that anything can be forgiven in principle, but sometimes that injustice gap is so big that although I can forgive that in principle, I can't forgive it in practice. It's practically impossible to get over. And then reconciliation, which is getting the relationship restored and trust restored between people, depends on two people, and both of them have to be trustworthy. So if one of those two people is not being trustworthy, if you've got a boss that's hurt you again and again and again, and you want to reconcile with this boss, but this boss is just bound and determined that tomorrow I'm going to hurt you again. Well, if that boss is not going to be trustworthy, there's not going to be reconciliation. This is what often happens with abusive situations. People, you know, go back into an abusive situation because they think, well, I wanted to forgive and I did forgive. And so then they get hurt because the other person is not willing to be trustworthy. And that suggests there's a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. That reconciliation is something interpersonal, whereas forgiveness happens inside our skin. It's a decision or it's an emotional change. And so that's what I have. Reconciliation is restoration of trust in a relationship where trust has been violated. Whereas emotional forgiveness and decisional forgiveness both occur inside our skin. Now, when I forgive, that does create in me often a yearning for, a longing for reconciliation. But if the other person is not going to be responsible, then I will have that yearning, but it'll be a frustrated yearning because we won't reconcile if the person is not going to be trustworthy. I might just say in passing that saying I forgive you is interpersonal, therefore it is not forgiveness. Forgiveness happens inside me. I can say to a person, I forgive you, and the person says, oh, thank you so much, and they turn their back to walk away, and I stab them in the back. What I say is not necessarily what I feel. The eighth fact is that we can reach forgiveness if we're willing to put in the time and empathize and give an altruistic, undeserved gift of forgiveness. This comes from a meta-analysis of all the interventions on forgiveness in which we found four things. We found, first of all, that the reach forgiveness model, which I developed, and the process model, which Robert Enright at Wisconsin developed, were used equally. And furthermore, each of those was used as much as all of the other interventions put together. The second finding is that, and I hate to tell you this, I really wish I could tell you that the reach forgiveness model is actually really head and shoulders the best, but in fact, all of these were equally effective per hour of intervention. The third thing that we found is we found a dose-response relationship where the more time spent conscientiously trying to forgive yielded more forgiveness. And the fourth thing that we found is that when we forgive, not only do we get to increase our forgiveness, we also increase our hope and decrease depression and anxiety, even though those aren't really dealt with. So this is the most important and useful point of this whole talk, and that is forgiveness is all about time spent conscientiously and sincerely trying to forgive. And so that is something to hold on to that. That suggests really that, you know, it's hard in like helping situations, running a group or psychotherapy. It's hard to spend enough time helping a person forgive so that they have lasting, strong results. And so what you have to do to help people forgive is you have to get them to spend time outside of the structured situation. So it's all about time. So what is this reach forgiveness model that I mentioned? Well, it involves making a decision to forgive, but usually that's the last thing you do. What we usually have people do first is try to work through emotional forgiveness by R, recalling the hurt, E, empathizing with the person who hurt them, A, give an altruistic gift of forgiveness, C, commit to the forgiveness that one has experienced, so that H, you hold on to that. It's easy to say those 5 steps. Takes a lot, you know, it's all about time. It's all about spending the time on each of those steps that will bring about forgiving. The 9th fact, forgiving yourself can often be more complicated than forgiving others. We have developed I've developed a way of helping people forgive themselves. This has been put into a workbook, and we have tested it in a number of randomized controlled trials. So this involves receiving forgiveness from God, working to repair relationships, reducing the rumination about the event, and then going through those the model of forgiving, and then applying it to yourself, and then accepting yourself, and then vowing not to do this again. So we found in a waiting list design that people who get the workbook get better quickly. Those who don't get the workbook don't change. When they get the workbook after a waiting period, they get better. So these things work. The last step, and so I'm closing in on the end here, is that communities can become more forgiving. And this has been shown in a number of places, some of which have been published and some haven't. But one of those is we have gone into 8 different Christian colleges and universities and 1 secular university, and run entire university-wide forgiveness interventions in which people have their awareness raised about forgiveness. It's been done in numerous Christian church communities, and it is now being done in secular form in a grant that's going on out of the University of Hong Kong, in which people in Hong Kong are submitted to this awareness raising of forgiveness. It's done in Indonesia, in the Ukraine, in 2 different sites. Of course, Ukraine is at war with Russia, so we've got serious events there, just like in Hong Kong. And Colombia, 60 years of civil war, it's been done, and South Africa. So I just mentioned one study that has been published, and that we just gave people ideas of things that they could do in their community. And we found that this affected the entire community at a effect size of about 0.02 per hour of exposure. And the average person was exposed about 2.3 hours. So I summarized at the end of my slides, and the Institute has my slides, and I'm fine with making them available to people, but I summarized those 10 steps that I just talked about, and just want to give you 4 points to take away. So this is what I think are the most important things. One, there's 2 types of forgiveness: decisions and emotional forgiveness. And there are other ways to deal with injustice besides forgiving. Second, there are benefits to forgiving that are spiritual, relational, mental health, and physical. Third, forgiveness is all about time. It's not about my program or Bob Enright's program or anybody else's program. It's all about time. And then finally, that there are these reach forgiveness workbooks and groups that have been proven to be helpful, and over 30 randomized controlled published studies, and those are available free of charge at my website. So I'd like to be able to answer whatever questions came up. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If you wish to have these, then I'm sure you all will figure out a way to get these to folks.
Thank you so much, Professor Worthington. We're actually recording this, and it's streaming live on YouTube, so people can see it and watch it and see the slides. But we're also happy to share them, if it's okay with you, with the others. There were a few questions in the Q&A, which I believe you responded to. One is, how does Islam see forgiveness versus Christianity and Judaism? And you talked about that and referred to the chapter where you talked about your authorship with others and colleagues doing work on the 3 Abrahamic religions. In my own work on forgiveness in the Middle East and in Muslim societies, we actually collected verses, Quranic verses that support and talk about forgiveness. It's a big theme in Islam, and I'm not an expert in Islam, I have to say that, but we did that and we found lots of verses. What happens is, of course, with all religions, is like the decision to forgive is different than believing that, you should forgive, which all the religions call for. And so I think you touched upon this question. There was a question about how to empathize. You talked about empathy as something that is one of the steps actually of forgiveness, and maybe it even narrows the gap of forgiveness. Do you want to say a few words about that? And then I have my own question for you.
Sure. There, in these workbooks or groups, we have many exercises that people can go through to help them empathize. But one that's been shown to be effective by itself is to use an empty chair visualization. So I'm not sure if you all are familiar with this, but you imagine that the person who hurt you is in an empty chair. And you just pour out your heart to that empty chair, to that person. And then you get up and you get in that empty chair and you respond back, trying to think of, why did they do this? I know I've hurt people in the past, and I very rarely have gotten up in the morning and say, oh, today I'm going to ruin this student's life, by doing something horrid to them. No, I usually have very good intentions, but the execution doesn't come out in line with those intentions. And so if I get in the other person's chair and think through what were they trying to do here? And then I have this conversation bouncing back and forth. That kind of conversation in itself can help people empathize with the other. You're literally sitting in the chair of the other person.
Thank you. There is a question regarding the tragic event of someone running over the family, the Muslim family from Pakistan in Canada yesterday, and someone said or is asking, how do you forgive? Should they forgive? I want to add a layer to this question. So, to hear from you, your perspective on this. In my work and my research, also in Muslim societies on forgiveness, in the research, one of very important aspects of people's willingness to forgive or not, was the intentionality. If someone wronged me, like the incident in Canada, if someone wronged me intentionally because of who I am, because of what, or get near my family, most of the people we surveyed said we will not forgive, that they will not forgive. And I think this is where the concept of justice comes in. You talked about it a little bit. There are lots of cases on country levels, politics, Palestine, Israel. Do we go to reconciliation? Is it time to go there or not yet? I struggle with these questions myself in terms of what's the right timing, I guess, for that. So what do you think about the element of intentionality, and should people forgive? Is that the right time for them, family in Canada, to say, oh, I forgive you?
So the position that I always take is that forgiveness is really a choice. And, what I entitled this was like, forgiveness is only one way of dealing with injustices. And it's not always appropriate to try to expect or hope that a person forgives instantly. Those are so unusual. They're like the Mother Emanuel shootings down in South Carolina, or the Amish, shootings back in nickel mines a lot earlier. Those made big news nationwide because they were so unusual. Most of the time, it takes a lot of time to get to the place where you're willing to forgive some big event. But fortunately, there is approaches to getting justice. There is turning it over to God and saying, I can't deal with this right now. There is forbearance, there's tolerance, there's acceptance. There are other ways of handling that injustice gap right now. And maybe someday I will get to the place where I can forgive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And by the way, you're perfectly right on the research on intentionality. There are probably 5 or 6 studies that show that if people think that they were intentionally harmed, they're not very willing to forgive. If they think it was an accident, they can give a lot more mercy there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. The next question is asking about something you shared. What's the difference between decisional and emotional? Which one comes easier? I think that was the question. Let me read it. Yeah, if we compare decisional forgiveness with emotional, which is the most common one?
Yeah, I would say I can tell you what the numbers are, and that is they're correlated at 0.4. 0.4 is not a big correlation, but it's not a small correlation either. They're definitely not joined at the hip. Just because you forget, you make a decision to forgive does not mean you will emotionally forgive. So they are related to each other. Now, what is the order that they happen? Well, often I can make a decision, okay, I'm going to forgive this person, and then I feel my emotions go down. But it doesn't have to be that way. Suppose that I hurt your feelings, and you're kind of stewing over this, and you look out the window, and I'm crossing the street, and wham, this car hits me and breaks every bone in my body, but I survive. And your empathy for that and your compassion for that rise up, and just, oh yeah, that little slight we had yesterday are meaningless, and you can emotionally forgive. You've never made a decision to forgive me, but you are emotionally forgiving. And later you could go back and say, oh yeah, I make it, I'm going to treat him differently whenever he gets out of a hospital 20 years from now. So, so you know, those two are related to each other, but there's no fixed relationship between them. They're fluid, and each person will, you know, kind of be wrestling with the decision. You know, I mean, a lot of people are like, you know, struggle for years to make a decision to forgive. And then after they make the decision, the emotions just flow. And some people can make a decision just like that, but just can't get the emotions to get in line, especially if they're getting hurt again and again.
Yeah, interesting. And a lot of the work, Professor Worthington, that you described goes on the personal, individual level. Now, if we move to, I think I come from society, community, culture, and many of our audience here too, I can assume, come from societies where there are ritualistic forgiveness, reconciliation. We call them sulha in Arabic, where you bring the people and have some kind of a ritual to bring people to reconcile. I think that this brings a very different entry point to forgiveness, but I don't think it means that people forgive. For example, Jordan, Palestine, if someone killed someone else from a different family, a different clan, you have to leave the village and go back 7 generations, for example. Now the Jordanian government is trying to work on that and make it maybe 3 generations, so it's not 7 generations going away and so forth. Or in Egypt, you have to lay down and there's a ritual. I don't know if I'm confusing the different countries here, but you know, you lay down as the offender and someone walks on you who's a leader. I think that's maybe southern Egypt. And so these are all rituals that are supposed to bring people to reconcile and forgive, but they're ritualistic. Do you consider those to be forgiveness or processes or decisions of forgiveness?
But I would consider all of those to be part of reconciliation. So reconciliation is rebuilding trust between 2 people who are trying to be trustworthy with each other. They may not be succeeding 100% of the time, but they're trying to be trustworthy. And so these are societal methods to try to promote a societal restoration of trust. So that's, you know, that's part of reconciliation. You know, you can reconcile without forgiving. You can forgive without reconciling. But if you reconcile, it does push people down the road to start thinking about forgiving. And if you forgive, it creates that yearning for reconciliation. So, like I say, they're related to each other. They're not joined at the hip. They influence each other, though.
I totally agree. And I work with someone who does conflict resolution and reconciliation, and we always, you know, talk about whether forgiveness is reconciliation or they can be combined in certain cultures and certain contexts. But I totally agree.
Yeah, in the societal, you know, forgiveness, you know, when we have this polarized world, you know, basically, no matter what position a leader takes in terms of, you know, transitional justice, or, you know, how do we put this forgiveness and reconciliation together socially, no matter what position they take, there will be people on both ends who are opposed to it, and sometimes violently opposed. They are never going to talk to each other and persuade the other side to do it differently. So if there's to be peace in this situation, if you think of this as a bell curve, you have to have people who are on the same side of the bell curve as you, that are having a conversation, an engaged conversation, that are saying, let's don't be quite so antagonistic. We can have our position, but don't be quite so antagonistic. Let's not be violent in this case. And that conversation has got to happen on both ends of that spectrum to try to move the ends closer to the center.
Thank you. Wonderful. I think that these were all the questions that people wrote. I hope if people have other questions, please feel free to fill them. We're almost at the end of our conversation with Professor Worthington. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your wisdom and work on forgiveness, such an important area. And I'm not biased because I think forgiveness really correlates with so many other things like empathy, spirituality, and well-being. I think you also talked about that, physical as well as mental well-being. So I want to thank you again for being with us, and thank you for sharing your work with us, with IIIT and our audience. And hopefully we'll stay in touch, and I'll share with you some of our findings on looking at collectivistic societies and forgiveness. That's something I'm working on right now.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone for being with us today with our Human Development Series, and we will keep you in touch. If you haven't signed up to receive our newsletter, I see that Salwa is putting it in the chat. We will inform you when we will have the next webinar, and in the meantime, have a wonderful summer, and we will see you sometime back in August or September. Thank you, and have a wonderful day. Take care. Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.